All right. One thing I really wanted to look over on Classic Plus is crafting. So I pulled up some windows here to demonstrate what this looks like for blacksmithing, because that's what I have the most familiarity with. And I imagine it's not that different for the other crafting professions. And obviously I'm primarily talking in this case that's about smithing, tailoring, and leatherworking. Engineering is generally pretty good. I'm sure it actually suffers from the same problems I'm about to list out here, though. For some of its leveling gear. So these are obviously the typical 1 to 300 guides. For classic, this is mining, and then we have blacksmithing over here. And obviously this is set up to be as efficient as possible with your resources to get to max level in smithing. It's not how to craft the gear you want as you level up, right? So let's go do an overview of what the problems with Classic WoW's crafting is, and basically all of its crafting in later expansions too. But we're really talking about Classic Plus here, right? So now let's look at zones by level real quick. Obviously your 1 through 10 zones minus Teldrassil is where you can find copper ore. And then the next tier is where you can find copper and then a little bit of tin, right? In 10 to 20, like Darkshore, like one of these places, there will be a couple of tin spawns, but they will be quite rare. Probably an order of magnitude less than of the copper. Then your next tier, which is really 18 to 30 or 20 like these, this is where you'll find more tin. And these are kind of an in-between stage where there's some tin. Red Ridge actually has a decent amount, I think. And for example, but then what you'll actually find too is that Ashenvale, Duskwood, these places is where now instead of finding a little bit of tin, you'll find a little bit of iron, right? So every time you go up a tier of leveling zone, you basically shift the 90 to 95% of the nodes of what you'll see, and then that last like 5-10% is the next high level of node. So that means that as far as mining iron goes, you'll find very little in Ashenvale, Duskwood, Wetlands, this sort of place. Then the next level of zone, you might think, okay, Hillsbrad, Thousand Needles, I'm going to find some iron there, right? And the truth is, Hillsbrad, you won't find very much iron. The only place where there's iron in Mithril of any significant amount is in this cave, and this is actually a pretty high-level cave, if I recall. I think it's a bunch of Yetis. These other nodes, again, they exist, but pretty rare. You won't really be consistently mining iron until you get to these zones. And Thousand Needles, it doesn't have, like, this is not as good a place to mine for iron as it looks. Again, the places where you can actually find the iron in Mithril are basically a little bit higher level than the range would suggest, right? Because usually where you're going to find this stuff is in the upper end of that zone. So in Thousand Needles, where you're going to find the iron is going to be like it's going to be a little bit higher level on the higher end of its zone, right? If it's 25 to 35, the iron is going to generally have the higher end of those mobs around them. So if you look at blacksmithing recipes, you'll see that in the level range where you can start, these items might be relevant, is for like green iron leggings, which takes iron to make and is a level 26 requirement. Let's say level 25 requirement. Level 24 requirement for these green iron boots, right? So these are some of the earliest iron items that you can make. Blacksmithing 145 and requiring level 24. but you can't really consistently mine iron until you're more like closer to level 35. Again, you can kind of start to get your hands on some at level 30, and if you're if you're a non-warrior class that has mining, you're probably in a better situation. Warriors are not the best at dealing with mobs higher level than them in Classic. And honestly, for example, if you're leveling a paladin like Rhett or something like this, they're not much better either, because they also are fairly weapon skill dependent to make their hits, because they're very auto attack based. Casters can get away a little bit more than some of the others in general. They can get resisted, so it's not perfect either. But then you have, like, say, pet classes and these sorts of things, so they can sometimes go a little bit ahead. But you gotta remember, it requires level 24. That's like the low end of a zone like Duskwood, and the places where you're gonna typically find iron in Duskwood, and there's only a couple of nodes, and it's gonna be like maybe 1 in 15. Like, it's somewhere between. It's closer to 1 in 20 than 1 in 10. Like, it's much closer to 1 in 20 of the nodes you'll mine in a place like Duskwood. There is one that is in a relatively lower end of the levels. The rest are like near the ogres, not the orcs. The ogres, and I think there's one that can kind of spawn somewhere along the middle mountains, maybe. But it's not like it would take you days of mining everything else to kind of run to eventually get that iron. Then you have some of these other items that seem like they might be pretty good, but you have to understand that a lot of these kinds of items don't necessarily drop from where you want them to, right? Like these golden scale leggings, the silver bronze leggings, right? These would be cool because, okay, level 26, but they use bronze. That's a lower level mat. And okay, 4 silver bars, that's not the worst thing to get my hands on. But this is not from a trainer. These are from a plant. So you're not going to get these, right? Plans like this, their drop rate is so low and random that you're never going to see them. Like, on your typical playthrough, if you want to level a profession while you're leveling, you're never going to see these plans. These are the kind of plans that people might buy at max level because they just want to have every recipe just for the sake of completionism. So you might as well assume that items like this don't exist. And a lot of the there's a fair number of items that look pretty good in your leveling list that you'll end up finding out that that's where they're at. And then I think some of the barbaric items are like horde only or something like this. I don't remember exactly. This is a sod item, so just ignore that. Green iron helm is actually not too shabby, but what you often find with items like this is that even if you can make them, and like the requirements to make them are kind of obnoxious, like a lot of times you'll almost never run into these gems even when mining a lot. 12 iron bars is a lot, and you have to get your blacksmithing up to that level, which is not easy. But at least it's just something you can train. But something else you'll find is that at level 29 you'll actually be able to get some helmets. And while this is often a great one at that level, within a couple of levels you'll have a helmet that's not that different from this. And oftentimes if you have the money to spare, you might be able to buy something comparable to, say, you know, the kind of good chest pieces you might run into, the shoulders you can buy at these different levels, like green iron shoulders. Oftentimes you'll find that there's something comparable enough that from just a random drop you can get in the auction house or from a quest or from a dungeon, right? Like a lot of times, for example, bracers or gloves, you'll be like, oh yeah, you know, the algae fists from OG Black Fathom Deeps are, if I got my hands on those, I really have no inclination to, for example, to go out of my way for something like these barbaric iron gloves, which have, which require 2 large fangs too, right? And that's kind of a weird reagent. Because the algae fists are pretty comparable in stats and armor, and I probably got them like 8 levels earlier. This massive iron axe requires leather, which is from another profession, 4 gold bars, which kind of hard to get your hands on. And at level 32, there's already items pretty close in power that you'll get just from normal things, right? So let's take a quick look at Cargo's made a list back in the day, you know, for to help prep people for the original Drop a Classic. And so for this is showing like Alliance weapon progression for a warrior. And there's basically these, so these are obviously like Westfall missions and these things. The Horde has a pretty similar list. It's not that different, right? It'll be different names and different quests, but it's pretty similar stuff. And what you'll find is on this entire list, the only time there's ever a weapon that really makes any difference is that's like a smithing one, is Copper Battle Axe. And there's really, you can see that the DPS between this and something else, like first of all, you'll get like 1 stat, like I think it's like 1 strength, compared to what you could just buy this claymore from a city vendor. And pretty soon you're going to be able to get your hands on some quest rewards. I think Edge of the People's Militia is one of those things you're not likely to actually do at level 11. If I recall correctly, I think that sword, that quest, yeah, if I recall correctly, that's not really a weapon you're likely to get. But Trog Slicer is pretty hard to get at level 13. But something this doesn't show here, which you can totally do, and that's actually more likely to be something you're going to do in Alliance even later on, is the Dun Moreau quest to get you a mace. That's actually pretty decent and kind of in this area. Oh yeah, White Weapon from Blacksmith Quest. This is something you'll, again, basically never do, right? Because think of it. In one level, there is... In just a couple levels, there's other better items. And don't forget, there's also random green drops. Right? There's just random green drops. There's all the stuff you can get in Dead Mines. Like, at level 21, 22, 23... are you going to spend all the time to level up blacksmithing, or are you just going to go to Dead Mines and try to get that? Like, you're not going to get Staff of Westfall at level 14, but you'll probably get it by level 25, 26, possibly 24 in a typical scenario. The thing about lists like these is you're not actually going from one of these weapons to the other. A lot of these weapons you'll sit on for like 4 or 5 levels and then get one big upgrade. So it kind of sucks as a warrior when you're in that position. Like Arceus. Arceus you're not going to get at level 29, right? Killing a level 35 elite. This is actually one of the ones that, funnily enough, even later on in the life cycle of a server, just because a high level character might swing by and just kill it for you, and Duskwood isn't that far from Stormwind. This is actually, despite being a difficult quest in a sense, actually one of the easier ones to do in a lot of ways. So the kind of idea behind something like blacksmithing is basically, well, as I'm leveling, this can fill in some of the gaps in my armor as I'm leveling. But what you'll find is the amount of materials, the kinds of materials required, and the level requirement of the armor compared to where you can acquire these materials rapidly gets out of sync. So if you take an inordinate amount of time to farm mats at a low level, say you go in Elwyn Forest at like level 6, something like this, you ran around and just mined and mined and mined so that you could fully outfit yourself with, you know, copper chain vests and some of these other things. And some of these, by the way, like gemmed copper gauntlets, also I believe a recipe. Some of these are quests. I think Ironforge breastplate is a blacksmith quest that requires you to turn in like 6 belts and 6 of something else, and you know, again, very copper expensive items. So again, not really something you're going to get. And it's entirely possible to mine as much of the material, like all the copper and stuff that you need to level to like, you know, 150 blacksmithing. I've done that without ever seeing a shadow gem, and only seeing like 1 or 2 malachite or tiger's eye. I've certainly gotten more than that before, or just found them. In fact, I think I've found them as random drops more than I've ever found them on nodes. But even at this low, it gets worse over time. But even at, like, think about rough bronze roots, level 13 takes 6 bronze bars to make this. You're not really consistently mining tin at level 13. The places you'd have to go to consistently mine tin are going to be, in general, like 10 levels higher than this. And that's basically the problem you have in blacksmithing the entire way through. But it just gets worse over time. Like the only, and the items that you would actually want, because they're all BOE, you might actually buy them if you basically leveled another character and then this was your alt. Then it's conceivable you would go out of your way to buy these things first. But again, you'll generally find that there is a similar level of power in either a quest reward or a dungeon item. Like Shining Silver Breastplate is great, but the getting your blacksmithing to 145 and acquiring these materials, the time and effort it would take to do this, it's like you can just you'd be much better served just leveling, and by level 30 you'll eventually get a chest piece that's as good or better. And the golden scale set is all like strength and spirit. A lot of these items are very disparate in level, so you never really have a good spike. By the time something like Massive Iron Axe is coming around, you're probably close enough to some of the Scarlet Monastery stuff that you're like, why would I care about this? I'm just going to do that. And there's honestly tons of items, like there's so many items that are as good or better than this at this level or lower. Like by the time I'm level 32 and this axe is potentially an opportunity, I'd rather just be trying to get Arceus. You also have the relative weakness of the weight stones and sharpening stones. The lowest level 1, right, the rough sharpening stone increases damage by +2. And by the time you're at the kind of drop you get from Mithril, so that's gone from, that's tier 1 is rough, tier 2 is coarse, tier 3 is heavy, tier 4 is solid, right? So you're on tier 4 of materials, and you've gone from +2 damage per swing to +6 from a sharpening stone. Even on a one-handed weapon with relatively high speed, this is not terribly impressive. The best thing that this would be for is basically some kind of dual wielder, like a rogue. So if I was like leveling a rogue, I would probably be happy to know someone who's a blacksmith, and if I could have some sharpening stones, that would probably, on like daggers with really high speed, might actually finally do something. But any warrior or paladin or anyone who's likely to have the blacksmithing profession, this is effectively useless, and there's nothing that modulates this for two-handed weapons either. And so on a two-handed weapon, it's not even like worth your time really. Even if you are min-maxing and getting every single possible buff you can get, like this is so little. And the only, let's see, what else? Okay, of course, yes. The keys, blacksmiths can make keys. I don't know that this has ever really amounted to anything. You make these enchanting rods. This is so pointless, really, that you could just remove this from blacksmithing and it wouldn't change anybody's feeling of being a blacksmith. Like, you could just make this an item that enchanters buy from a vendor and nothing would really at all change in the game, to be honest. Which is probably true of these things that engineers might need for some items, because I'm going to go ahead and guess here, because I don't know, but I'm pretty sure of this. Most of these kinds of items are effectively a waste of time. I am guessing that most of the time when there's an item like this, engineers are just leveling in ways that do not require these materials anyways. And they don't really care that much about anything low level except bombs, because I'm guessing the guns and everything else they can make, as far as gear goes, either don't require this or are not worth the effort. Then you also have items like this, Frost Tiger Blade. By the time you can use this weapon, level 35, there is pretty much every weapon you'd want to get your hands on outclasses this by a large margin. It's hardly better than Arceus, right? So it's barely an increase already. And then look, Corpse Maker from RFK is already better. Because bear in mind, it's higher DPS. This has 1% crit, which doesn't really matter in low levels. And pretty much any item, like Arceus has this problem too, but at least Arceus has is relatively good DPS for its level. Arceus also has one of these proc do some damage kind of bolt effect. Arceus is like arcane damage. This is somewhat useful, I guess, in the idea that it launches a frost bolt. But also, you're probably never gonna run into this because it's from a world drop recipe. Requires this alchemy item, 2 jade, 4 heavy leather. And every time you see items that have some kind of chance on hit to do this thing, bear in mind, the game doesn't even tell you what the proc chance is or what the proc per minute is. So when you look at it, you really have no way to evaluate it, right? And any item that is, say, not a max level item, that is pre-bis or a raid item, has almost no incentive to do testing on it. And that's the only way that we ever end up knowing what the procs are on this are. So, like, is it 5%? 20%? I don't know. I have no idea. Doesn't tell you. So why would you want to use it? Instead, the mobs you'd have to kill to get this quest are too high. But yeah, getting Razorfang Crawl is not insane to potentially do, nor is Nomergon. But there's other just standard quest rewards or green items you can find. Again, Whirlwind Axe, you can just ignore, you're not going to get this. But Bonebiter is not uncommon for people to be able to get their hands on, because all you have to do is a quest line ahead of time, and then boom, do SM. And then SM also has Ravager that drops off Herod in Armory, and Mogrine's Might. So you're pretty flush for great weapons in this category, actually. Oh yeah, that's one of those other ones. So you have all these items, and I'm sure other professions have these too, where you're like, what? Who is this for? This has no use case. This item could be deleted and nothing would ever change in the game. So like, what a bummer. Like, why isn't this a blue that's way more badass and powerful? You know what I mean? Like, why not? It's a rare. If it's gonna be a rare drop with weird requirements, it should at least be strong. But it's just not. It's just bad in every possible way. And then as you go on, you find that that's kind of what happens with a lot of the gear you can craft. Now the mithril set is stamina with heavy armor and no other stats on it. And then when there's mail, it's like got spirit and 1% dodge. Like, who is this? Who is this for? strength plus, and then like essentially spell power, kind of weird. You do start seeing these shield spikes, which again they're so weak that there's no you don't care to have them on your low level gear. You won't notice if it's there or not. And at max level, you're never going to use them because you're either going to be Fury Prot, or you would put a Stamina enchant on your shield, as opposed to a shield spike, because they can't both be there. Again, all the gear you can make, there's better items from quests of the same level or dungeon gear that is far superior. And it gets really weird once you get to thorium sets, because these are all just like blanket res pieces with high level requirements. Like they're just terrible. The Imperial plate set is, I guess, not the worst thing ever, but again, I'm pretty sure there's better quest rewards or comparable. And again, the requirements for a lot of this stuff is just insane. Like at level 47, you're not going to be getting your hands on a lot of thorium. Right? Like at level 47, where are you hanging out? These areas, there's not a lot of thorium in Tanaris, and there's not a lot of thorium in Searing Gorge. There's a little bit of thorium in these parts of Tanaris. There's small thorium veins. And by the time you're in the places where you're going to consistently find any thorium, because again, this has got a little bit, yeah. A lot of these areas where you're going to find thorium, it's not easy to mine. And remember, especially if you're a warrior, being of similar level to the stuff that might be around veins or in caves, dangerous, a little bit denser, and if you're already killing that stuff, it's sort of like, why am I bothering to do this rather than just finish leveling to 60 and then go back and level this up. But then the only good items you have at end game from blacksmithing is Annihilator. And not because it's a powerful weapon, but because it is an extra Sunder effect, right? Then, of course, you have Lionheart Helm. I don't remember where the legs are, but there's a set of legs too. Possibly some of the fire res gear early on. But what you'll notice is this is all BOE, right? And elemental sharpening stones are essentially alliance only, because Horde are going to have Wind Fury, and you can't have them both. I think this might be the only shield you can craft. I don't know if this is a sod item or a original item, to be honest. And of course, Nightfall. I guess you could say Sulfuron Hammer, but I don't think anyone really cares about that all that much. Oh yeah, Titanic Leggings, that's the other one. So what you'll notice is you only need, in a sense, you only need, what, 2 or 3 blacksmiths on your entire server to get access to the items that are relevant. And even this, a lot of the gear you can craft, you're like, what is this for? This has some very niche uses. So throughout your entire leveling journey, you're screwed over at every turn, and you only need a couple of people on your server to be this profession in order to create those like BIS or near BIS items. And the only sort of consumable item you could make is only relevant to one faction, Alliance, which is the Elemental Sharpening Stone, and that's all you have. So you have no item that is like a consumable style item that's competitive at all with engineering, which is to say sappers and bombs. So I imagine that's probably true of the other ones. And in TBC, for example, leatherworking gets drums, and in Wrath, all these things also get like just a random stat stick that they add, which isn't very interesting. And again, also just doesn't displace engineering in any way. I have no desire to see engineering nerfed, but you sort of look at something like blacksmithing and go, why don't you just can't you make an item that shares cooldown with Sapper and does an effect? Like you could make like a weapon oil style thing that on when you use it, has a Sapper cooldown and just makes you do like a cone of damage with every for the next melee strike or the next X melee strikes, doing a cleave kind of effect for some sort of elemental damage. Or the is it blacksmithing that has the runes? Or maybe they add those in TBC. I'm forgetting these things, but they were like runic ward things you could apply to yourself. I don't remember if that's even a blacksmithing thing, but it would just give you like a bit of damage absorb. Then you have, I guess you have keys, and then you have the mithril spurs, but like, and I guess weapon chain, right? But these are all so niche or so bad that they basically shouldn't exist. So as it stands now, in a sense, blacksmithing doesn't need to exist in Classic WoW the way it is now. It might as well not. If you were to ask me, I would just go through and I would retune all the level requirements, material requirements. Even if you didn't make any other changes to the items, I would at least do that. I'd probably go through and buff a lot of items too, and I would also possibly do away with world drop recipes for blacksmithing, or have some way to acquire them, because right now they might as well not exist, right? They're just there for you to make an end game for completion's sake. And I imagine this is true of the other crafting professions as well. You don't have, tailoring, I guess, can make bags as you're leveling, so that has some niche use on a fresh server. Leatherworking, I guess, has armor kits. I don't know if that really means it. Is that kind of just a joke? At least in the Burning Crusade, a lot of these professions at least had BOP items that were powerful enough to be relevant in some of the tiers. I think that should certainly make a comeback. I think it's also plausible to make it to where they can actually craft weapons or armor, depending on the profession, right? That is actually competitive with the best items in that tier. I don't see why that couldn't be a thing. And it's also a shame because occasionally professions, like, you gotta think, you miss out on the fantasy of being the person who's leveling their crafting while they're leveling. Like, oh, I'm a warrior who uses my own weapons that I made. I'm a mage who can enchant and craft magical equipment for myself. You don't get that. And then a lot of these professions also have quests associated with the professions, but most of them are just not worth doing. Like, yeah, copper chain vest. That's right. You have to get this required level 5 item. What you need to do to get these plans is like a complete. This just makes no sense to do, right? I don't remember. Yeah, because you have to turn in a bunch. 6 axes and 6 copper chain belts. Yeah, complete waste of time for something that gives you +1 strength and a little bit more armor. Like, the net power you net from this is so little compared to the time investment. I'm not sure how good the barbaric iron set is for Horde. I've never done it on that side. The Mithril Order quest is actually kind of cool. This is one of the coolest things for this profession is this quest, and you get this cool little trinket. But when you actually, it's not like the immunity to fear is pretty cool, but chances are, if you're leveling blacksmithing, you're most likely a warrior, so getting immunity to fear actually becomes not that great. I forget what Hammer of Expertise does, but it. I think profession quests are really cool. Oh yeah, and that's right. You have a bunch of stuff to even get your hands on these things are pretty insane requirements just to get the actual plans, let alone then what. Oh my god. Like, think of this. You have to turn in a ton of thorium bars just to get an item that costs another ton of thorium bars and isn't good. Like, at level 55, there's dungeons you could run that give you better gear. I don't know how this compares to other professions, but it feels like such a bummer to have, you know, another way to differentiate a character. Like, class quests are cool, and then you also have profession quests, but they're all kind of bad and disappointing. Some class quests are pretty good, are good, right? And Warrior has a couple that are good, and it has a couple that are duds. But how much more exciting would it be to have actually like involved profession quests that the rewards are strong enough that you're in, just like with the gear you can craft, you sort of think, man, if I'm willing to invest all this time it takes to level my profession, you'd think the payoff should be good. But no. All that time invested, and what you have you're going to replace in probably like 30 minutes. You know? And what's the harm in there being somewhat more powerful items at lower levels for these professions? If you're worried about this making like alts overpowered or something like this, you could include a few more bind on pickup recipes. And I imagine, like, for example, it would probably take a while if I had to sit down and comb through all the recipes and kind of and see all the relevant quest rewards you can get and make a more coherent idea of what your gear progression would be. But a part of me just thinks I don't think it matters that much, because unless you're going really crazy, the numbers you can tweak are not going to change. First of all, they're not going to change endgame balance at all for like the vast majority of items, and you can certainly tune those ones as well. And even though people could then potentially buy and sell BOE stuff, I would sort of say, well, that's actually the kind of economy that's basically missing, because generally speaking, there's only a handful of these items someone would even be interested in while leveling, as it is now. There's a lot of greens just in that level zone that are random drops that are comparable, that people already might buy and sell. And as far as someone doing it on their own character, again, the time investment for leveling something like blacksmithing is incredible. You're still better off ignoring the profession and just leveling to 60 and then going back and leveling your profession of choice. So really, the only thing that hurts is the player who made the mistake of choosing a terrible profession, which is to say basically anything except engineering. It's like, because enchanting is sort of similar to blacksmithing in that you only need a couple on your server to really at all, right? And as far as something that's useful while leveling, the only professions that are truly useful while leveling is engineering and then alchemy. And alchemy is still more of a hardcore style thing, because you're probably still better off just leveling in a normal situation than trying to keep up your herbalism in alchemy so that you always have potions available to you. In general, if you need a couple of potions, you'll probably be able to just buy them from world vendors and to suit your purposes in almost all circumstances. And if you just look at the material requirements that you need to level blacksmithing, and this is perfect world, right? This is absolute perfect situation in terms of leveling your profession, because this is assuming that, in a sense, that you did all of your farming ahead of time or bought from the auction house, because this is not the kind of this list does not at all reflect what it would be like if you were also going to craft a few pieces for yourself along the way. And look at the requirements on thorium bars and mithril bars, and then iron and steel. Which is, if you just look at the iron bars, that's essentially the total, because steel is made out of iron bar plus coal, right? 30-star rubies, like, truly the investment just does not compare at all to what you get out of it. So if one of the things I would like to see in Classic Plus is basically go to like blacksmithing, and I assume leatherworking's not too far off, and tailoring, and even I imagine the non-consumable items, which is basically anything but bombs and sappers. I know engineering goggles tend to be pretty decent, right? But like I imagine all the guns that and stuff you can make while leveling are not very good. But so primarily tailoring, leatherworking, and blacksmithing really deserves not only do I think every profession deserves like actually cool profession quests to get involved in that have a real feel of a storyline to them, which I think would be amazing, and I would love to see that. What they all really need is a total rebalance of all of their professions. I mean, just look at some of the items that you might have like wanted to be able to craft at a low level, but the plans are very rare, and then even if you get them, the time investment just doesn't make any sense. Real bummer, you know. So I would do a total rebalance on all of that, and in an ideal world, I would actually change a lot of these items too. Like a lot of them can just be buffed, and on top of just, I think, as simple as telling me what the chance on hit is in the tooltip, and ideally if there's an internal cooldown or the proc per minute, I would really like if that was just always in the tooltips. But I'd love to see a little bit more interesting effects on some of these items. But, I mean, honestly, 99% of the items in most of these professions need just a complete reworking, in my opinion. And it'd be a much better place for that. Even enchanting. If we were to look at enchanting, you would see that a lot of the low-level enchants are very weak. And this also includes some of the lower-level enchants that are what you might call, like, hate enchants. You know, if you play card games, sometimes you talk about like cards that associate with like a tribe tag, a sort of creature type, and you would call something that affects that directly like a hate card, right? Like this kills a beast. So in WoW I think we generally just have beast, undead, and demon slaying weapons. I think those are the only hate enchants that are available, and I think the only time these ever really get used is I don't know if there's actually one you ever bother using in Nax against undead. I don't recall. And I think there was some demon slaying stuff you might do in TBC for some of the raids. But most people generally just would, you know, do whatever the standard enchant is and not really worry too much about it. But in any case, you sort of find yourself going, why don't you just make it so that, like, if I get minor beast slaying, it's actually a fair bit of damage, and hey, if I can get that at level 30, maybe it makes me a little overpowered against beasts. Like, what's the big deal? is it really? Do we really think this is going to break the game? Like, I don't think so. So I would love to see all the professions get some kind of item that's not not just their version of. I guess you'd say. I guess you could say it's their version of Sapper. But I would totally be. I think most of us would be completely fine if Sapper was still the BIS item to use. I think it would. People would just enjoy it if they didn't feel bad for playing the professions they actually want to play to fulfill the fantasy of their character. Like, if you're a tailor, if you're a mage, you might want to be tailoring and chanting because that suits the fantasy. But you probably still feel like you're griefing because, oh yeah, I really should be engineering because Sapper is just the best. Well, if you had some kind of consumable item that did something, even if it only got you half of the way there, it's classic. It's not going to be that hard. So that would be probably more than enough to feel good about it, especially if you could do cooler stuff throughout your leveling journey. So that's kind of my short take on the crafting currently in the class in what I would like to see for Classic Plus and sort of the sorry state of crafting in Classic. I've been trying. I only recently decided to try and level a character in SOD so I could see what it's all about. It's kind of tough for me because SOD doesn't really match my desire for what I want in Classic. I like a. I don't know if simpler is the right word. It's hard to describe. It doesn't feel quite right. It might be in part because the rune system is kind of weird. It kind of feels like I would have preferred if this was put into talents as opposed to the way this is done, but whatever. So I don't know what the craft. If so far I've seen that it looks like there's a couple of recipes that are sort of more like the Sulfuron hammer, and that they're related to what you can get from one of these leveling raids. So I don't really know what the SOD crafting regime is like, but again, I think it's all the base recipes that really need the most attention. So I think I feel pretty safe in saying SOD hasn't really changed these professions in a meaningful way. And I would in fact like to see more recipes, but I also think you can get pretty much all the way there by just editing the ones we currently have. And as far as also items more generally, I do think, one, like I mentioned, it's not good that we don't see the proc rates and the proc information in the tooltips of items. And it's especially bad on items between, low levels and then up to level 60 basically, because these are items that no one has really any incentive to test. So even if you wanted to look outside on Wowhead for that information, which you're basically just not going to do for a low level item, it's never worth your consideration really. Because again, like an item at level 60, like Iron Foe, people would test it so they'd have some vague idea of what the proc rate is, so that you can actually crunch numbers on it, right? But no one's ever going to do that for a middling tier item. And even if they did, I don't even think it's worth the alt tab and the Google search to pull that item up and see what it is. You're just going to look at the stats, you're going to look at the weapon damage and that versus stats, and you're going to make a snap decision, and basically anything that says chance on hit to shoot a shadow bolt for this damage, you're just going to rate that as essentially nothing. That's really what you're going to do, right? Or you might look at it as it's kind of close to +3 strength maybe, I don't know. You're basically going to pretend it does nothing, that it's just a white weapon. And I think that's kind of a bummer, because you could have all kinds of rarer drop items. You could even add in more rare mobs and increase the spawn rates of rare mobs and increase their tables, and drop items that have more interesting effects, which would make your different run-throughs of like leveling a character a chance to be a lot more interesting. You can also do that on items that drop in dungeons. I think the funny thing about Classic is it reminds me of how I felt in a lot of ways about Dark Souls 1, which is that if you ever played Dark Souls 1, it had this interconnected world design that was just mind-blowing your first time, like when you played through it the first time, and then if you did like subsequent playthroughs, you felt like a wizard, in the sort of genius sense, right? Because suddenly you knew how to get overpowered early and where you could make these crazy shortcuts and do all this weird stuff. And then Dark Souls 2, you're like, oh, now it's not interconnected in the same way, and there's a hub location. There's still like shortcuts in the level, but not there. And then in Dark Souls 3, you're like, oh, it's like that again. And that's just kind of how the games have been since then. And you sort of went, oh, I mean, I still like these. I like From Software games, but I'm still always like yearning for this Dark Souls 1 true sequel with this crazy interconnected world design that I never got to see, right? And then I also, in a lot of ways too, what they did a remaster of Dark Souls 1, and I remember thinking I didn't really want a remaster, I wanted a remake, because the second half of this game is like unfinished. The second half of Dark Souls 1 is an unfinished game. Like, if you ever go to Lost Izalith in Dark Souls 1, you're gonna go, what the fuck is this, dude? What? There's like dinosaur butts jumping on me in a lake of lava. Like, what? The boss doesn't even feel like a real boss. Like, what is this game? And that's kind of how I feel about Classic WoW sometimes. But in that sense, sometimes Classic WoW feels like the first half, like basically the leveling part of the world feels incomplete in the sense of like how the crafting works and some of this. And then there's all these, but it also feels unfinished because there's all these zones you can't go to. There's all these storylines and quest lines that kind of just trail off, and I think they sometimes pick up in later expansions, but it just doesn't feel quite the same, right? So both of these games to me are games that I'm like, I kind of wanted that remake. That, you know, I wanted to go back to Dark Souls and be like, what did you guys actually intend to do with Lost Izalith? Like, what could these areas have been if you had had the time? And a lot of time, and also in just how I felt like the interconnected world of Dark Souls 1 was clearly never picked up again in subsequent installments. That's sometimes how I felt about some of the items you could find in Classic WoW, because Classic WoW just has some of these weird items. And I know in later expansions they've made some pretty funky items, but generally those are more like toys and doodads that don't have any relevance outside of things. Whereas in Classic, there's occasionally an item that just does something strange, and again, sometimes they're ones you might have actually used, but generally they're also items that end up not getting used. But the itemization just gets more boring over time instead of more interesting. So that's kind of the thing that was also a bummer with Classic WoW. You're like, oh yeah, this is that, you know, they moved away from that design, and over time moved even more away from that kind of design. Let's see, what was I always lose my train of thought. Oh, it's right on the tip of my tongue. Right there on the tip of my tongue. Oh well. Can't recall it, but yeah, that's more or less what I was thinking. Because yeah, I know I was thinking about item drops, and I like the idea that when you're leveling another character, there's a chance of actually finding world drops or crafting items and other things that are actually powerful and relevant, because you have some of those in your leveling journey in Classic. Probably the craziest one I could think of is if you actually got Whirlwind Axe at a low level as a warrior, which is never going to happen on a first playthrough. It's just because even if you had a level 60 person to help you kill the elite mob in that quest, and to give you all the materials you need to be ready for that quest, you still have to. They would also have to follow you to STV and help you farm all the troll tusks or whatever they are in STV. So getting whirlwind axe at level 30, which you could do, and if you do, you'll feel like a god for about 10 levels. But the amount of investment that is required to pull that off is what justifies being able to do that. And I like the idea that there's more items like this that basically, if you want to waste the time trying to farm out or get these specific items from dungeons or rare mobs or crafting, that you actually have that level of a payoff. But you'll still, but like, while that's overpowered early kind of stuff, it's also like the time investment means that you're still losing on net. Do you know what I mean? Because someone else could have just blown past you in leveling with, you know, quote unquote subpar gear, hit 60 and started that. Yeah, I think that pretty much covers. Again, I know I missed something I wanted to talk about, but that kind of hits the major points. Oh yeah, I always love, so Demon Forge Breastplate, I think at level 60, I don't know if it's only in the pre-patch for TBC, there are some AoE specs you can make with a paladin to like clear places like Strat. No, I don't know if you can't do it in Strat at level 60, but you can do Mock Cathedral, I think. But in TBC, you could use this for your AoE builds if you wanted, some of them anyways. You wouldn't use it in slave pens, for example. I guess you could use it in slave pens, but probably not as good there, but it was pretty decent in Strat. You know, mentioned that you can't make shields, which is ridiculous. Yeah, I mean, I sure would like to see cooler itemization in general and just weird stuff. Like, look at that, minus 40 spirit. Why not? It's a shame you're basically never going to use this weapon. Certainly want more profession quests. They're so cool. I think it'd be cool too if there was some class specific profession quests, you know? Like, I think that would be pretty cool. One thing I think about Classic Plus is I think people get way too focused on raids and end game content. I've always felt that these games get way too obsessed with raids and end game content and forget that these are RPGs. And having so I know they added Mythic Plus kind of stuff in retail World of Warcraft, but most of those just end up getting too hard, if honestly. And when you have all these like crazy differences in difficulty, that's all well and good for the people who are really hardcore players, but a lot of your player base basically ends up feeling like, I'm a loser because I'm not doing Mythic plus 20 keys or whatever it is, right? And trying to get to that point it's sort of like if I get back into League of Legends, right? I can play back in the day, so this is back before they added Emerald tier. It was a long time ago. I could play at like a diamond ranked level. If I got back into League now, how long would it take me to get back up to that level, to catch up with all the knowledge, catch up with all the strategy, get all my skills back together, which I'm older now, so frankly I'm just not going to be as on point. The amount of time I would have to invest to get to that level of skill is just like, I don't have that kind of time anymore, you know? I've got shit to do. I've got I don't even want to admit how many dogs I have. I have so many dogs, and keeping a house clean with that many dogs is like having a part-time job, and then I have a full-time job. and that's not even talking about house maintenance, right? Um, so I don't get to participate in all this in a lot of this stuff. And even if, like, say I did the normal version of a dungeon or raid, I'm like, oh yeah, but I'm a loser because I didn't do the heroic raid or the mythic raid. I didn't do the real game, right? I kind of lost my train of thought on that one too, didn't I? I'm real smart. Anyways, oh yes, of course, duh. So for me, I think a lot of what's missing in later retail World of Warcraft, and what I would love to see in Classic Plus, is more RPG elements. And so of course, profession quests are badass and cool. It's another thing that makes you feel like your choices matter, which is why I want to see them be actual options next to engineering. I think I'm totally cool with engineering still being the best and having all the funnest toys. I just want the other ones to actually be worth mentioning, you know, and worthy of consideration. I want them to actually be fun to level with, so that if you feel like taking your time and making gear as you go, you actually feel like it mattered to do so. I do think it's worth pointing out that you don't want to completely destroy the gear progression curve, because it's not just gear progression that matters, it's the visual progression of items. That's one reason why you have to be careful about the appearance of items you give at certain levels, because you don't want to make people look too badass, too cool. I actually think that one of the problems with heirloom gear that they added is that it destroyed your visual progression, because you started out looking like you're wearing full crazy plate armor or whatever, right? And that's actually, I think, extremely relevant. And when you couple that with like transmog, then I think it really destroys the sense of going from zero to hero, if you will, like the standard RPG story of a character. Which is why I think it's actually cool if you even further do it by having class-specific profession quests. And maybe vice versa too. I certainly would love to see class quests. I think Legion's class order halls were a really cool idea. And obviously those, in the context of Legion, were very much like you're the hero of the hour kind of stories. With the kind of cool backdoor that I always enjoy that Blizzard has put into some of their games, where, in a sense, if you're the paladin hero, then it's sort of inferred that one of the other class order hall people you encounter is sort of, instead of it being the other player, like I think you can think of someone who's a mage or a fighter or a demon hunter or something who's in the class order hall, who's probably nominally taking your place, right? Like I imagine Darian Mograine is the Death Knight hero, right? The actual official one, right? I imagine the paladin hero is probably that, what's his name? The half-elf guy? I think is he the son of like Turalian and Illyria? Is that who he is? Arathor the Redeemer? Am I thinking of that right? He seemed to be the person who would otherwise be the paladin hero, right? Kind of how if you play Diablo games, there's like a continuation of the storylines of the previous playable characters of that. It's something that Blizzard, I think, has always actually done rather cleverly. But that's a digression. So obviously you don't want to be the big damn hero, but even now, like when you're doing your class quests in Classic, at level 1 you're just like the little punk on the street. By level 10 you're getting your first class quest, and that typically is kind of like, yeah, you're like an initiate, you know, you're just getting your feet wet. And by like level 30 they're like, hey, you've actually you're like a competent person now, like you have a reputation. Like people, it's actually comparable to Dungeons and Dragons if you think about the tiers of play in Dungeons and Dragons. I forget the precise ones, but something like level 1 to 5 is like the village level, you know, the town level, and then you kind of get to like city and / like big city / like kingdom level, and then you kind of get to the more larger continental level, and then you sort of get to world, and then cosmological. You know, now you're fighting in heaven and hell, and it's vaguely like levels 1 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15. Often I think you look at what spells are capable at those levels, and that's kind of how you determine the level of the tier of play you're at, because you sort of look at what ridiculous things spells can do, and you're like, oh, that would change the world. So if you think about that in Warcraft terms, it's sort of like at level 10, you're a village level. You know, you help out the local town. You beat the goblin camp. In normal terms, so in WoW terms, that's like you kill the Murlocs. By level 30, you're actually dealing with like real threats. And then the next pretty noticeable tier is really the end game, like 50 to 60, and that's when you're sort of like in Warcraft 3 terms, you went from like a footman to like an upgraded knight, you know, or a low level hero, like a level 3 hero unit, you know, or maybe a level 6 hero unit at most, right? Like you're kind of in the talking now, but you're still part of an army, which I think is some of the appeal of Classic, is that you feel like, man, at max level, you know, I'm like one of the members of the army of like a Warcraft 3 army, right? That's kind of what you feel like. Versus retail WoW, where you feel like you're the big damn hero. And that's not necessarily a problem. I enjoy being the big damn hero in a lot of stories. Like, I like Dragon Age Origins, and in that you're definitely a big damn hero. I think in every single Legend of Zelda, right, you're a big damn hero. That's totally fine. There's just something charming about Classic, and I think it kind of also should show that in a lot of D&D campaigns, not many people get to high level play, and a lot of campaigns just end by the time you're getting around like 10 to 15. Most campaigns will end by then. Most will probably end by level 10, and not many people do that high level adventuring. And I think that's because the levels of power you get to just start getting just a little wild, and it gets further and further away from what feels a bit more like I don't think realistic is the right word. Maybe just feels more tangible because it's more relatable to what we deal with in every day. Whereas when you start getting to going to heaven and hell and dealing with the planes and this sort of stuff, that's like the equivalent of being the president, you know, where you're like, I'm not someone who knows how to deal with international politics, you know what I mean? Like, but it's like more than that, because it's that at least would be like, oh, I know what the real world is like. It just gets too far away from you, which is kind of what I think is one of the major problems with retail WoW, is you just get too far away from what feels like the normal world, and you do it for so long that it all just you can't really take it seriously anymore. It just doesn't feel like anything anymore. I don't know that there's actually an answer to this. But if I was to try to come up with an answer that you could possibly do in Classic Plus to this kind of issue, it would be, as opposed to, say, you're several patches into your Classic Plus environment and people are all decked out in their endgame stuff, I think you would actually get more out of creating an entire new world with an entire new 1 to 60 experience than trying to keep escalating the current setting. And my thought on that was something like, what if you took, just as a working example, right? You took something like Outland, and you said, we're going to redo the entire story of Outland, we're going to redo the entire zones of Outland, and we're going to create sort of the World of Warcraft of Outland as it stood in this time period. So a 1 to 60 leveling experience where you guys play as the people. It's not like the Dark Portal opened and you're going there. It's like the Dark Portal's closed and you're equivalent of the Alliance and Horde are like, if you're a human, you're either directly one of the original people from the Alliance expedition, or you're like the child of one of them. Because I'm not sure if the timeline would support that. I think it does, though. I think that would be possible. And basically, your playable races would be like human, Draenei, Blood Elves, Orcs, of course. I mean, heck, this might actually be a chance to try and do Naga, but I think there's reasons why you don't do Naga. I guess you could do the Broken too. Maybe you could have a demon-based kind of race. Maybe you have half orcs, you know, to fill out some of this. You know, humans, elves, and orcs have been knocking around there for a minute. Maybe some of them have, you know, made friends. And so you'd have entirely different factions. I mean, you could even do it where instead of for pseudo alliance versus horde, you could have it like alliance expedition. I mean, you could have that versus the orcs, right? Or you could have it be like Shatrath versus Illidan. I mean, I don't know exactly, because I'm just sort of spitballing here, but the idea is more like you can recreate pseudo, like, quote unquote alliance, quote unquote horde, or try to find a way to kind of make them mesh in that way if you want to eventually combine the worlds. But you basically just create an entire new 1 to 60 experience with entirely new everything. I think you would get more out of that, to be honest, than trying to continuously milk the end game. Either that, or I would find other ways to have people want to make a new character and go through the experience from 1 to 60. Because every time I've seen this game, it seems to me that there is something fundamentally ruinous about end game focus. Right? Almost every great game ends and you make a new one. Dark Souls 1 does not port in my character from like when I play Dark Souls 2, I don't port in my character from Dark Souls 1. And even when I play, even if you play a game like Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3, or the Dragon Age games where you import your character and you carry certain stuff over, basically what carried over was certain choices, and you effectively start over as a level 1 character, right? And the MMO version of this is giving you 10 more levels to level and just invalidating your gear. But you just end up with bloating everything. Everything just gets bloated. You bloat the levels, you bloat the talents, you bloat the gear, you bloat the numbers, you bloat the spells, you bloat all the collectible crap, you bloat the zone, you bloat the world, you invalidate the old world. And, you know, Blizzard has done this test for quite a long time, and it seems to me like it's a failing proposition. And you also lose the appeal of, you can't draw someone in who feels you want to, because here's the problem, you want to reward your remaining players by saying, well, you have this achievement system and you save all of your progress, right? All that stuff you did, it's still there, so you're a very special little boy. Pat you on the head. But that fundamentally makes anyone who didn't start with you feel like they have no... You try to give them the chance to feel like they can catch up by invalidating all the previous era's gear, but they'll never be able to catch up on all those achievements, right? Not really. Not with any kind of normal time investment. So in a sense, they always feel like the ship has sailed on them, especially if the game continues to get harder and more complicated. Then it's a bit like when if I try to go back to League of Legends, I know there's going to be this big learning curve that's going to suck, and I'm going to be terrible until I overcome that learning curve. And the longer you go on this track, the bigger that gets, and so you have an ever shrinking player base. So I'm sure I'm not saying anything Blizzard and developers aren't aware of, but it's very much a damned if you do, damned if you don't. And my suggestion for this is you you don't try to create just 60 plus, you know, this is more content, but you're still level 60, or here's 5 or 10 more levels and we'll do what we've done with every expansion. My suggestion is you create reasons to start over at level 1. Possibly again by just creating an entirely new world. You're like, guys, this isn't Azeroth. You guys are playing on Broken Draenor. You're Outland people now. Okay, actually, you're on an entirely other planet in this cosmos. This entire 1 to 60 experience is going to take place 3,000 years ago now, right? A totally different time context. Whatever. Or find some, or maybe you do alternate Azeroth, and it's like, this is an alternate history, and the whole thing is when you start is it's like, instead of Arthas becoming the Lich King, it was like Kael'thas became the Lich King. Like Arthas actually, instead of purging Stratholme, he listened to Medivh and fled with Jaina across the sea, and then it's Kael'thas who for some reason picks up Frostmourne, right, and becomes the Lich King. And you just have an entirely new alternate history. And so when you come, your 1 to 60 World of Warcraft experience is just it's completely different, right? I'm aware that's way harder to do, but I think you'll get more out of that. And the other thing, the reason I initially thought of the one with Outland being that way is because if you did that, you could actually, assuming that essentially it otherwise takes place in the same timeline, maybe you change some of the lore and probably have a Kael'thas not turn into an idiot any more than he already is anyways. Is you could actually at some point eventually connect the worlds, right? There'd be some fiddliness with this, but you could conceivably have a point where then the Dark Portal does open and you're in quote-unquote TBC, but basically now you can use your characters from the other world in Outland and vice versa. Which would be able to make people feel like what they did mattered still. Anyways, that's just me spitballing, so I'm not I'm not gonna like stand behind this as absolute the right thing to do or anything. Just kind of where my mind went. But anyways, I really just wanted to talk a little bit about crafting. Spit some things out that I think are, again, I'm not looking to see the balance super crazily upset or anything. Just stuff that makes people feel better about making the kind of role-playing choices they really want to make while leveling, while in a sense giving a fresh coat of paint to Classic. So anyways, not that anyone's watching or listening, but if you are, thanks, and take care.